Now, I've been scared before, but until earlier this year, I didn't know what it was like to be utterly terrified and to be surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people who were all simultaneously feeling the same way. Earlier this year, I was caught up in a natural disaster, and it lit up the global headlines and made the news in the days and the weeks that followed. But for those of us that were actually caught up in it at the time, it felt very much as if we'd been left in the dark, certainly for a period. I work in communications, and in that instant, I could tell and feel the difference between knowing the news and seeing the news and actually being able to take action when you're caught up in something that's just overwhelming you. I work for BBC Media Action. It's the BBC's international development charity. And we use different sorts of media, mobile phones, social media, film, TV, radio, whatever's most appropriate, to help people who are living in poverty. And the idea is that they can access information, exchange ideas, and learn things to help shape their own lives. Things like their health, their rights, how people might hold their leaders to account, and as I'm about to demonstrate, how useful information can be in an emergency as well. Now, I was in Nepal earlier this year, and I was there to gather information about the different communications that people were using in the country. Mobile phones were prolific, that was no surprise. Everybody was using them. Some people were using them to share information about market prices and using it for business. Others were listening to the radio on it, all very useful and all what you'd expect. But I was perhaps slightly more surprised to see how extensive internet access was too. And even up in remote parts of Nepal, up in the mountains, people were using cyber cafes, they were using social media, they were communicating the world over, just the way we do anywhere in the world. So I was in this communication-rich environment. I was intrigued and interested when I arrived and I got to my office in Kathmandu, and there, the sort of local equivalent of James Bond's Q in the office gave me this. And I wondered what it was. What communication device could this be? I wondered if it might be a mobile phone, very small one. I wondered if it might be some teeny-weeny camera. I wasn't sure what it was. And frankly, when I opened it up and I got what was in here out, I was a little bit disappointed. How very low tech. Wasn't what I was expecting. But actually, I was told I needed to hang on to this, because if that long-anticipated, much feared and overdue earthquake really did happen, then this might be really useful for me, because it might help me be located if I was in a building that collapsed, and then rescuers might be able to find me. So, as it happened, only a week later, on the 25th of April, I was extremely glad I had this on me. Now, where was I? I was up on the 5th floor of a boarding house in Kathmandu. I was due to fly back to London that evening. Beautiful views of the mountains, hazily, it is smoggy in Kathmandu, and the cityscape. And I was working at my desk when all of a sudden, this happened.
The lunchtime news now on BBC One.
More than 500 people are now known to have died in a powerful earthquake in Nepal.
High 7.9 magnitude.
People in the city running in panic for open ground.
Worst earthquake in 80 years.
Extensive damage to buildings and reports of people trapped in rubble.
Now, I've been scared before. But this was taking it to a whole new level, and it started as a shaking that traveled up my body, and then it felt as if the hotel was being punched really rapidly. And then it felt as if the hotel was actually being picked up like a dog with a bone and shaken vigorously from side to side. So the concussions were really huge. And accompanying these big movements was a terrible sound, and it was the sound of people shouting and screaming. And they weren't just shouting in the building I was in and the buildings surrounding me. It seemed as if they were shouting and screaming way up into the valleys. So I knew it was huge. But what on earth do you do when you're caught up in that situation? I had my whistle, But at that moment, I wasn't entirely sure as the milliseconds passed what I should do. So I surveyed my situation in this shaking room. At the desk, a television screen crashed to the floor, and at the same time, a very big, heavy wardrobe that was over by the window suddenly seemed to come to life, and it started coming towards me. And I was concerned, actually, that it was going to block the doorway, which was my exit onto the corridor and my only way out. And it was at that point that I came to my senses, and I jumped into the doorway, and I looked out. And out on the corridor, I was now looking up. It was no longer like that. And at the staircase at the far end, between me and that, the walls were really vibrating and shaking very rapidly and very hard. And I didn't fancy my chances of being able to run down this corridor and get out without A, falling over, or perhaps B, the building collapsing while I was just trying to make that journey. So I decided to stay put. And I stayed in the doorway and I braced myself. And I sort of surfed for a minute or two. It was no more than 2 minutes. It felt like an eternity, but I was just bracing myself in the doorway. And then the shuddering stopped, and then I ran. And I ran down the corridor, down the stairs, up the garden path, and out to a forecourt where everyone in the hotel was now assembled. And I looked around me. The perimeter walls of the hotel had fallen down, as had some of the other buildings nearby, and they'd now collapsed in rubble in the road. There were people running up and down. Some were holding children close to them. They were trying to find a place of safety, just trying to get somewhere where they'd feel okay. A woman in the hotel I then noticed had injured her leg, and there were several of us trying to attend to her. She'd fallen over. But more than anything, what we all realized in that nerve-shredding period was that we didn't know what to do next. We'd survived that thing, but what do you do? And when the aftershocks are coming every 20 minutes, it's really quite something. It's really not good. And so after this concussion of sounds, there was a new silence, which was a bit eerie, actually, in between the aftershocks. And you could feel fear, palpably. And it was settling like the dust around us. And it was felt as a downward lurch in the stomach. And for me, I felt it like a stone, very heavy in the pit of my stomach. Now, people were starting to come back who had been at the hotel and then had been out sightseeing or doing whatever they were doing. And some of them were covered in grime, some of them looked really shocked. And they showed me on the backs of their mobile phones and on the backs of their cameras what they'd seen, and they were very distressed. And it was buildings that had collapsed that they said they didn't think families would have been able to get out because it just pancaked down. Information was very patchy, and rumors were starting to circulate. Taxi drivers stopped and said, "Jump in, everyone, we're going to go to the airport. Flights are taking off." And someone else said, "There's absolutely no way flights are taking off." And sure enough, of course, there were no flights taking off. And we were starting to hear patchily information from other parts of Nepal, up in the mountains where it was said to have been very bad and the help was going to take a long time to get to people. Avalanches, landslides, floods, flimsy buildings collapsing. All this bad news. But then there was a good sound, and that good sound was the sound of helicopter blades getting up and into the sky, a clattering. And that meant that the people that we were heard that were being dragged from the buildings and put at the side of the road in the hope that someone might be able to help them, finally some of them were being reached. So, at that moment, I managed to speak to a colleague of mine, someone who lived somewhere else in Nepal and who works there. And she said, "Come to my house because you might be safer there." So I got up and I went, and half an hour journey across Kathmandu was very peculiar, as you can imagine. People were starting to get ready for a night out on the streets, dragging out their bags, putting up tarpaulins, getting water out and ready. Nobody wanted to go back into buildings because the aftershocks were so severe. And it felt, because everyone was out and everyone was chatting and nobody was doing anything you usually do, nobody was working. It felt like some weird dystopian bank holiday. And a group of Nepalese people called me over, and I went over to say hello to them and to see what I might be able to do to help. And they said, no, we're going to help you, because we've heard, our neighbors have told us, and it's all the room around here, in half an hour, at 6 o'clock, there was going to be a massive earthquake, much bigger than the one we've just experienced. So you need to get somewhere really fast, keep away from the buildings, and get somewhere to keep yourself safe. Very kind of them, but as I rushed off, I thought, there's no way you know. The science isn't that good, I'm afraid. How big aftershocks will be, where they will happen, when they will happen, nobody really knows. But in an information vacuum, people will try and be helpful, and they will try and tell you what they've heard. I got to where I needed to get to, and in that garden, there was a tarpaulin up, and it actually became the office centre for the next few days, because our own office was considered to be dangerous. And I started to see my colleagues, who I'd only seen rehearse do this before, they started to put into action a plan I'd heard about, and that's called lifeline communications. This is very different to the news you get from correspondents who go in and go out and tell you what's happening. This is working closely with the local people, helping them access information based on their needs, listening to what their concerns are, and trying to negotiate and work out with them what's the best thing to keep them safe and then help them move on. So, within hours, we were working with BBC Napoli on BBC World Service and managing to get some of that initial information out. And within days, we were linking in with a network of 250 radio stations based around Nepal, in remote places, up high in valleys, community radio stations, helping them get information out to the people who needed to know what was happening and what they needed to do next. Now, there is another really useful bit of kit we use, and it's called a suitcase studio. And this is pretty much what it says on the tin suitcase. You plug it into an antenna and to a generator, and hey presto, you have a compact, robust, portable radio studio. And our colleagues, my colleagues here, you can see them rehearsing. This is actually ahead of what happened, and they were training up other radio stations to use it. And this is a really important piece of kit. And what we're doing is we're trying to provide people with practical, actionable things they can do. How they can trace missing relatives, how, if you're pregnant, you might be able to get some help around the birth, where you can get blankets as it's starting to get cold. And what we were doing is reaching the 2 million people who were out on the streets of Kathmandu and who were stuck up in remote places, but were managing to get information through radio. Now, the information does evolve. At first, it's all about survival, and then it moves on to the next phase, which is helping people know what they need to do next. And as the monsoon closed in, and as the weather got colder and wetter, it moved on to helping people find out about how they might start to get back inside their houses, how they might get blankets where they could access them. And also, it's got a psychological value to have that regular information going out to people. Things like what you can do with your kids to give them some reassurance, get them back into school, and where school might be safe. Now, in total, 9,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and 25,000 people were injured, and many, many people lost their homes and livelihoods. Nepal is now off the news headlines as other disasters hove into view. And what this means is that people are now after new sorts of information. And you can feel in an emergency situation, as if there's nothing you can do to help. And there are so many crises going on, whether they're earthquakes or whether they are wars or economic crisis, refugee crisis, take your pick. It can overwhelm you, and you can sort of think, well, there's nothing I can do, it's all too much. And you can feel a compassion deficit. You just want to look away. But actually, it's not that the world is a more vulnerable and volatile place. It's that we are communicating better because our global networks connect us and things don't stay in the dark. And what this means is it's a good thing, although it can feel overwhelming, because we can help people and we can let them know that we're going to ask our leaders to help them too, and that we're going to insist that they collaborate and act together. And we can do our own things too, whether it's dipping our hands in our pockets and giving some money to a local or an international aid effort. And it's also, if you're able and if it's appropriate, you can volunteer. And this way, we can start to link up. Disasters do not care if you're rich or if you're poor. They don't care when they're going to happen, where they're going to happen. It can happen absolutely anywhere. And it made me think of Hurricane Katrina, which happened, of course, a decade ago, 2005, hit those Gulf states of America. And there, the global response was phenomenal. And it came from some pretty unusual places, too. And there was one nation I wanted to focus on right now, a nation that was very poor. More than half the population survive on less than $1 a day. But they're resilient, compassionate, resourceful people. And they decided they wanted to help, and that nation was Nepal. Nepal gave $25,000 to help American people who were suffering their own disaster. Now, it's not so much the amount that counts, it's the very gesture. It's that idea of trying to reach out and help people. Because media in emergency situations does more than just provide news. Communication is aid. Thank you.